Okay, thanks. So we talked a little bit about critical thinking, right, and the epistemological crisis we're in right now. So let's start moving on to what actually social theory is. There are two different perspectives on social theory that I'm going to mention here. The first is what I'll call a positivist, and the second is interpretive. So, what do I mean by a positivist interpretation? Well, if we go to a science, a scientific understanding of theory, uh, you know, let's go to physics. Einstein gave us relativity theory, and it was a theory about how the world worked. From that, they were able to, physicists were able to um, build tests that eventually um, showed Einstein's theory was closer to correct. Remember the last video, than Newton's was. Than Newton's were. So we knew we were moving on to something. They did. I barely understand that stuff. Um, and so you would have the theory. The theory would help you generate hypotheses that you can test, where you've got one variable and another variable, and then you could run an experiment to test those hypotheses, and your theory either held or was disconfirmed. So if we think of social theory that way, then then we're thinking of of things that we can, well, like let's think of Marx. Marx has this idea of alienation. If we're thinking of, and we'll talk about that later, but if we're thinking about theory in that positivistic sense, meaning positive science, then you've got Marx's theory of alienation, which we'll get into later. Then you would say, okay, so we're going to measure alienation like this, right? And Marx says alienation comes from late stage capitalism, so we're going to measure the economy this way in a variety of different economies. And then we're going to see if these measurements vary with these measurements, and we'll be able to say whether or not Marx's theory of alienation is correct or false. And if you go read the sociology journals now, they will discuss theory, and they will often discuss that relationship between the theory and what they're trying to test in what they're doing. Like we still do that in the social sciences, and actually up until well, we'll save that for later. But remind me to do Parsons and Mills. The other version of theory, though, is what I would call interpretive. And, you would say with that one, it's kind of more like what you're trying to do is shine a light on a situation. You're trying to understand something a little bit differently. And so the last video I mentioned feminist theory. And you will find a whole host of stuff that falls in those kind of categories, and it's valuable stuff. Feminist theory, we might call it race theory, I'm not sure. Queer theory. And so what they're doing with those is not so much trying to come up with a grand plan for how the world works, and then from there delve into hypothetical relationships, and then how to test those relationships with variables. I mean, I guess you could, but mostly they're trying to understand. They're trying to understand now and maybe look back at history as a way of understanding it differently, right? So, what's a good example of that? If we looked at sociology of the families in the 40s and 50s, there was this the kind of theory that held was very gender based. Men were the instrumental part. They were the ones who went out and did things in the world. They made the money, did the politics, built the houses, fixed the cars, like all the stuff that was stuff that needed to get doing. Men tended to do, and women tended to do the effective or the nurturing kind of stuff. They were in charge of taking care of the children, and they gave their husband love, and they made dinner and took care of the inside of the house. And there's a certain amount of stuff, of course, that required. But more importantly, what the women did was about love and family work, and what the men did was about out in the world and doing things, work, instrumental work. Now, the thing is that's a perfectly, as a social theory of the American nuclear family, that's a fine theory, right? And it explains an awful lot. You can actually have a little bit of fun with it. You actually can have a little bit of fun with it. So why does it not seem to matter if a guy gets old and gets gray and he can still attract women? Well, according to that 1940s theory I just talked about, it's because it's not his physical beauty that he's bringing to the table. It's his money and his position, his instrumental position in the world. And similarly, why is a woman 25 so old and and theoretically aging out of attractiveness? I don't think that quotes. Well, the answer is because she's bringing family love, and in order to have children, it's better to not wait too long, or it gets harder and harder for the person who's got to do the actual physical work of birthing, carrying, and birthing the child. And since women didn't have that much access to political and economic power, of course, that them getting old and not being as beautiful as they were when they were 22 is a negative. Okay, so the 60s, 70s, 80s happen, and now we have feminist theory. And well, feminist theory will look back at that family relationship and say, well, gee whiz, if women are excluded systematically from the workplace and systems of power, then what you're looking at is something that looks a lot more like oppression. And it's not that they're the caretakers of the home because that's what women are best suited for. They're the caretakers of the home because they're actually excluded from the instrumental sphere. And both of those are equally valid interpretations of the American nuclear family in 1950. I do think the old-fashioned one was like a little self-obvious. It took a lot for granted. But you can see that what they're doing with the feminist theory is they're saying, okay, well, here's this situation. Here's the way the old-timers understood it. But if we approach it from a lens of women are often taken advantage of in our world and excluded from elements of power like social power, political power, economic power, then that family situation looks entirely different. And so that would be the interpretive or the illuminative approach to social theory, and it's a different way of understanding it. And you really have to have these two ideas in mind because social theory can be both things. Now, they're not two completely separate circles either. There is some overlap of the Venn diagram because as a unit of study, individuals and societies are fairly difficult to pin down. Um, the definition of ephemeral is like something that you think is there and then you go to reach it and then it's gone like smoke. And social concepts are often a little bit like that. Um, we can talk about power and we all understand what that is, but you start zeroing in on what that actually is, and all of a sudden it's a little bit harder to understand. We can talk about um, money's a great one. Everybody understands money, but when you get right down to it, you start trying to define it, and whoosh, it floats away like cigar smoke. Um, and so even the most positivistic, most scientifically oriented theoretical explanations have elements that are interpretive in them. And notice even the interpretive example that I gave um, about feminist theory, kind of revisiting old-fashioned family sociology. You could actually, if you tried, um, define some of those things into measurable units and do cross-cultural study and be able to say, whether or not um, there was a measurable level of female oppression and what effect that had on social structures in a society. Um, but it gets a little bit challenging, and you have to be willing to draw a box around what it is you're talking about that makes that doable. Okay. All right. What are we at? 11 minutes. That's good enough.